In today's video, we're taking not just one, but two Deimos pattern Rhinos from box to battlefield. Welcome to Hobby with Ollie. My name's Ollie.
And my name's Meg.
For today, for the unboxing and building portion of this box to battlefield, I thought it might be entertaining to have a bit of a chat with Megs about her experience with her first ever Space Marine tank. So I'm going to be painting a Rhino for my Blood Angels, and Meg is going to be painting one for her Alpha Legion. This is a few new things for you today, right, Meg?
Yeah, definitely. So it's my first ever tank build, and the first time I'll also ever be using an airbrush on an actual model.
What are your thoughts on the kit as it's your first time looking at a Space Marine tank?
So as Alpha Legion Horus Heresy is my first Marine-based army, they're a bit harder to build in the fact that you can't just leave sort of the janky corners and things. It has to be more like sanded and more polished and generally, I suppose, a bit more perfect, which just definitely makes it a little bit harder in terms of the build, but definitely an interesting challenge.
Other thing about the unboxing, we only get transfers for 2 legions in the box. What do you reckon to that?
I was incredibly disappointed by this. I'm not gonna lie. When I opened the box and saw that there were transfers, my first reaction was, oh my god, there are transfers! And then you pointed out that they are only for 2 legions, which neither of us have. I suppose it's either that it would be more beneficial if they either included transfers for all legions, which I know is quite hard because there are so many legions, or the opposite of you had like generic transfers that can work for everyone.
How are they going to charge £20 a transfer sheet if you don't?
If you don't then only include a couple of the transfers for 2 legions in a box.
Yeah, exactly. So, moving on to building, primarily we were sort of building the main bodies of the tanks, and I decided that it would probably be a good idea for us to leave the tracks and stuff separate. Normally when you build your models, do you build them in sub-assemblies or do you sort of build them all together?
No, so I generally build them all together, more from like an excited point of wanting to build everything and it all be kind of complete in one. So then I find it always a bit, I suppose, sad to only build parts of it and not have like a full completed model at the end.
To keep our metal parts separate, we stuck them to some cardboard using masking tape in preparation for spraying them silver in a moment. But first, a word on the superior engineering of these new plastic Rhinos.
I've got a spring-loaded Rhino there.
What you always wanted. Who needs jump packs when you can have a spring-loaded backdoor?
Now the first thing we did was to prime the tanks, and Meg's fingers here, with a black undercoat. I'd always recommend using a black undercoat just because it's going to give you more leeway if you do make any mistakes.
Yeah, I think it hides a lot of small imperfections.
Yep.
We'll say, not mistakes, small imperfections.
Small imperfections, small improvements to be made for the next model. Now up first, let's look at painting the Alpha Legion tank. I wanted us to use a sort of undershade method, and here I was kind of using this as an opportunity to show Meg the basics of the airbrush. Now to start with, we gave it an all-over base coat with gunmetal. At this point, you were a bit confused as to what was going on.
So in terms of my past experience with Alpha Legion, it was very minimal. So it was a bit confusing at the start, and I'd never done anything really with the airbrush. So following on from painting the gunmetal, we then went in with shades and then highlights, which is something that I've never done before, particularly then knowing what was to come after that.
Yeah, so for the shades, we used a really thinned down black paint. This was to go down as a kind of filter over the model and sit into all of the recesses. Now at that point, you were actually quite happy with the paint job. We then used a Vallejo steel colour as the highlights. What did you think after we put the highlights down?
So I think without having a clear understanding of what was to come, I found the highlight bit really hard because for me it just felt like really bright and like I'd completely covered up all the shadows that I'd just done.
I probably should have done a better job communicating to you that the airbrush we were gonna come back in with different layers and be able to fix bits up. The first couple of layers of highlights, you were just kind of looking at the model in horror, like I had such good shadows and now it's ruined.
I think I'm more used to an heavy metal style paint job. So for me, I've never done something like that. Everything I've done has been very much like cover it in shade and then do highlights on the edges.
Panel highlight literally everything for like 3 years.
Exactly.
Yeah. Once we'd managed to get all of those silver elements applied, we then went over with the next colour.
We went in with a layer of Achillean green and contrast medium.
Yeah, we mixed those in a 50-50 mix to use it as sort of a filter over all of that silver. So the main thing was to avoid full power on the airbrush is going to just eradicate any of that shading that we had before. It's also going to give you lots of blowback, lots of spider webbing, all the things that we want to avoid to make sure we get a nice thin layer.
I'd definitely say that you also get better the longer that you're doing it, because I think at the start it's like, oh dear God, where on earth is this pointing and how hard am I meant to be going?
Yeah, because I think that was one of the things I hadn't even considered. You asked me, how do I know where the airbrush is pointing? And I kind of said, you just kind of look at where it's pointing.
So by the end, I started by putting my finger where I needed the spray to go and then spraying it onto my finger to see if it was going in the right place.
And then you could remove the finger.
And then I could remove the finger and it'd be in the right place.
Yeah, which is pretty much the same thing as doing a test spray on the paper or onto the cardboard.
Yeah.
Right? You can see where it's going to go, and then you go in, right, I know roughly where I'm pointing, and I've got my eye in, as it were, and you can then use that to paint the rest of the model. For all that you were hard on yourself about it, I think you ended up with a really, really cool finish on your model.
Yeah, so I think in terms of the overall look of the airbrush paint, I was really happy with it. When you look at it, it looks like, oh, they're just pointing a spray gun at something and then painting it, and it seems like that's logically a simple thing to do, but then when you actually do it yourself, as much as sometimes it's easier with certain things, like if you're painting a big model, it is a lot easier to get a similar coverage over the entire thing. I'd also say that for Alpha Legion, obviously with painting the silver underneath and then the blue on top, I think you get a much smoother finish with an airbrush than you do with a paintbrush, because I did try that and I thought it looked an absolute mess. I would then want to do that with the airbrush, but details I would always probably stick more to a paintbrush. But then on the flip side of that, I would say that for certain things like detail work, I personally would say it's quite hard. I think over time I would definitely get better at it. Still a learning process.
So have you got an airbrush? What was your first time using it like? Let us know down in the comments down below. So Meg, this is your first time using an airbrush. If you could give one tip to somebody who's watching, what would that be?
I'd say probably practice on something that isn't your model, just so you can try things without it ruining everything and then being sad about it.
I'll say that terrain and things is a really good place to practice because you've got big wide areas, you've got things that people aren't going to pay too much attention to, and it just gives, it's really freeing, and it's where I actually practiced a lot of my airbrush skills, was painting up terrain. Next thing we're going to move on to is painting the Blood Angels tank, and I used a fairly similar method. I wasn't painting a metallic scheme, but I followed a very similar principle. I sprayed all over using a mahogany from Vallejo. This is a kind of dark brown, and I used this as my base coat, which was going to persist in all of the shadows. Next I came in with Vallejo red, which I sprayed over all of the panels, pretty much just leaving it in the deepest recesses, so around the sort of panels around the front, in the crevices around the door, things like that. I added a bit of yellow into the mix, and I used that as my sharpest highlight, so around the edge where I decided the light source was coming from. The last things that we had to do were some of the details. One of the advantages of using an airbrush is that with the bodies of the tanks done, now all we have to do is focus on the details and make them really pop and stand out against the airbrush work that we've already done. For my model, I had the Marine with the multi-melter and then also the heavy bolter mounted to the top. What did you opt for as your weapons, Megs?
So I went with a heavy bolter, smoke launchers, hunter killer missile, and then my personal favourite, which was the Havoc launcher.
Yep, gotta have missiles.
I had wanted to also have the multi-melter, but unfortunately can't have both a Havoc launcher and a multi-melter, so I went with Ruler Cool because I'd say the Havoc launcher is definitely cooler.
So for the weapons, we were using the box art as inspiration. We painted the weapon casings black. We highlighted the black casings of the bolters using the medium gunship grey from Vallejo, and then onto all of the metal bits, it was gunmetal, shaded with non-oil, highlighted up with steel, and then on some of the tips, so on my multi-melters, for example, I used some copper, and then shaded over that with a bit of Agrax Earthshade to show a little bit of use as well. I actually did a similar thing with the smokestacks coming out of the top of the exhausts on the side of the model, where I shaded over the tops using Agrax Earthshade, and then towards the top, I actually glazed a bit of black paint, so that it looks like sort of soot is gathering around the tips as well, and highlighted a little bit around using steel as well. For the Marine on the top, I just left it with a fairly simple paint job. I stuck to the airbrushing, I put in a few little recessed shades with non-oil, and then also gave him a few gold and silver details. The gold is just Retributor armor washed over with Agrax Earthshade, and the silver is just gunmetal washed over with non-oil and then highlighted back up using Vallejo steel.
I will say I'm not sad that I didn't do a little guy on the top, but I did chicken out a little bit of including a guy, because I was already like, I've got enough painting to maybe do this week, but I think next time I do a tank, I'd definitely include a little Marine on the top, because I just think it's quite cool.
Now we both decided to put on dozer blades, not because we're really planning on using them in game, but just because they look dope.
Yeah, pretty much.
Yeah, pretty much. Rule of cool.
Yeah, so I did some final details for the lights on the tank, spotlights, and the screen that goes in the back of the tank.
Which no one's ever going to see.
No. But it was a good test piece, at least, for me to work out my finger pointing, airbrush pointing technique. So we airbrushed them white, and then we added a little bit of yellow to keep it like a really faint yellow hint to it, which I think worked out really well in the end, and I think the white underneath made that yellow pop a lot more.
Absolutely. So you can see the difference between on my model versus on Meg's model. On mine I went straight away with yellow, whereas on hers we went with white first, followed by the yellow, and I think hers just pops a lot more. On the inside I did a little bit of a glow effect using sort of a bit of green and a bit of red as well around the edge, just to give a bit of interest if people are peering in the back of that there. So here we have the completed models. So, final thoughts, Megs. How did you find your first experience of building a tank and airbrushing?
Overall, I think I'd say really good. I really enjoyed building my first tank, and definitely something that I would do again. Like I said before, I really loved the tracks on the bottom. I think they are my favourite part of the model. But overall, I think it's a really cool model. It was generally easy to build, and yeah, I'm really happy with my final paint job.
I'm similarly pretty happy with how mine's turned out, although, as I said, I am very jealous of your blue armour. I think it looks really, really cool.
That's fair. It's, you know, I am cooler, so...
Fair enough. Building in sub-assemblies was the big takeaway I had for this particular paint job. It made it so much easier when it came to painting in all the silver details, and just made it take a lot less time as well. You know, a lot less faffing around with getting your brush into hard-to-reach areas and things like that. We'll be including these rhinos in a battle report for next week's video, but thank you so much for tuning in. Just wanted to say a big thank you as well to everybody who has subscribed to the channel. We've just hit 1,000 subscribers. Yay! 1,000 subscribers. So yeah, thank you so much. I've really been enjoying the journey of building and painting and doing all sorts of things on the channel for you, and I hope you continue to enjoy in the future. In the meantime, my name has been Ollie.
My name has been Meg.
And we'll see you next time.